The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
Welcome back to Titans of Nuclear. Today we continue our special series, Nuclear Nexus, focusing on the intersection of data centers and the nuclear industry. Today I'm joined by Alan Howard, Principal Analyst, Cloud and Data Center Research Practice at Omdia. Alan, welcome to the show.
I'm so pleased to be here. Thanks for having me, Michael.
So before we dig into the wealth of topics that can fit in that theme, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got to the position you are today.
Sure. So I've been with Omdia for about a little over 6 years. I work in something called the Cloud and Data Center Research Practice, which you coincidentally mentioned just a moment ago. And we're a team of about a dozen people that studies everything that revolves around data centers. We have analysts that study IT equipment, physical infrastructure, and data centers themselves, and then some analysts that are deep into the cloud world. Before I did this, I spent 5 years working for a real estate company that specialized in data centers. I wasn't a real estate agent or anything like that. I did commercial consulting and data center assessments and things like that. And while it pains me to say this every time, I've been in the IT industry for 40 years. And so I don't think we really want to go back that far.
I'm sure there's enough to fill a couple hours worth of episodes. So maybe we'll have you back for a sequel. Yeah, maybe give us a flavor then. You've been on the operating side, now the research side. Give us a flavor of some of the themes that have shaped the industry kind of leading up to today. You know, what were the if we were having this 5 years ago, what would we be talking about?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot has happened. I mean, if you want to go back in time, you know, when the dot-com bubble burst in the very early 2000s, that was really kind of the catalyst that kind of brought the data center industry into the trajectory that it's in now. But you know, one of the things that's really changed things was the advent of cloud, you know, a good dozen years ago, if not a little bit more. And data centers grew at kind of a mild pace for a long time. And one of the reasons for that is that, you know, the data center industry, those companies that build data centers and then lease out that capacity to other companies, you know, one of the primary markets would have been the enterprise world, banks, manufacturing companies, so on and so forth. But it took them a long time to sort of evolve into understanding that, you know, this is actually a very cost-effective way of housing or siting our IT equipment. And so, you know, what's been happening is that those, you know, what we refer to as secular demand drivers have been growing and growing over the years. But the cloud industry itself really just skyrocketed, say 5-7 years ago. And that created a demand for data center capacity that's been, you know, obviously unprecedented up until now. So, you know, and kind of in summary, those secular demand drivers have been driving increased demand from the enterprise world. And then the big cloud guys have just catapulted into what is just almost ridiculous in terms of the amount of data center construction and expansion that's been going on.
Yeah, and it's It's funny. The cloud is actually a set of physical hard infrastructure, right? As much as the moniker suggests otherwise.
Well,
Um,
we like to say the cloud lives on the ground.
yeah, it's great. Uh, yeah. So okay. So you've got 5 years ago growth that was unprecedented, probably until the next 5 or 10 years, right? So
Yeah.
tell us about the trends you're seeing now as far as, is it just the same secular growth, but more? Give us some more of that detail and then what that means from a sighting perspective.
Yeah, it's the same secular growth plus more. I mean, it keeps evolving bits and bits at a time, but
Pun intended.
obviously yeah, right. Good one. No, but I mean, really the big news right now, obviously, is the surging popularity of artificial intelligence, right? And so, when Chat GPT came, I mean, AI has been around for a long, long time. But when Chat GPT came out, that was a catalyst that kind of woke everybody up. And I remember we have a whole nother team of analysts that studies artificial intelligence. And long about the second quarter of 2023, when the wheels were coming off and all these private equity companies were making multi-billion-dollar announcements about data centers and this and that and the other thing, I went to one of our AI specialists and I said, was I missing something or did it just come out of nowhere? He was like totally blindsided. I mean, it just
Hmm.
it took off in such a way that it's had a significant impact. And so, we've seen situations like this in the IT industry for years, right? New technologies that promise to sort of transform the landscape. And yet, when you look at technology adoption cycles for different kinds of technologies, um, they tend to vary quite a bit. But there's some interesting things about what we're seeing with AI that would suggest that there's more evidence that what we see coming is probably going to materialize, unlike some other things. Just as a quick example, we started talking about edge data centers, quite some time ago, and it never really materialized exactly like we thought it would. It's going to be a slow roller before it gets to the point where it's has a big market impact. But again, with AI, the potential use cases, the adoption so far suggests that we're going to see that. And what that means is that the amount of power demand is going to grow significantly. The other really interesting piece of evidence, of course, is just how successful NVIDIA has been in terms of the demand for their AI hardware it's incredible. I mean, as an analyst, one thing I can say is that, over time, we'll see how it plays out because it's not a long-term hockey stick. It's, the hardware is a hockey stick for a while and then it's going to taper off some and whatnot. But the power demand still seems to be quite significant. And I want to keep going on about this, but at NVIDIA's GTC conference last week, I wasn't there, but our server analysts were, and they announced yet a new version of their hardware that consumes even more power.
Hmm.
And so this makes it kind of an interesting challenge as we're forecasting power capacity demand for the data center market.
Yeah. So I think you listed a couple of things. You have a lot of things to touch on in there, but I want to start with kind of the question you stopped just short of saying specifically, is it real or not, right? Is this another
Yeah.
bubble or is it real? And I got a couple of things the reasons why you think it's real. One is the supply side, right? The supply chain is mobilizing and selling, right, as an early indicator. Second are user adoption rates. And so I'll put words in your mouth, but things like, you can have your email written for you, right, from these platforms, or search results with artificial intelligence. What are the other things that you say, oh, in previous hype cycles, this or that wasn't there?
I would say it was just the same two things. What we've seen in terms of adoption and heightened awareness. For example, on the consumer side, a lot of consumers never really understood that there's AI out there that will help you just generate brand new pictures of things by just describing it. And some of that stuff's really incredible and fun to use. And so, yeah, it's just a heightened awareness amongst the consuming community. One of the other things I think is generally common too is that as more awareness is generated just in the news media, right? Then the higher up the ladder you go in corporations, that's when higher up executives start to take notice. They say, "Oh, wait a minute, get the IT department in here. Let's talk about how we can exploit this to increase, say, for example, our customer engagement, activities and things like that." And so they're not really aware because it's been kind of flying a little bit under the radar. One of the things that I think I've always been impressed with was artificial intelligence being used in radiology to help interpret radiology pictures and stuff. But that is another one of those drivers that, once the awareness starts blossoming like that, and at the executive level, they start seeing, news stories on CNBC or whatever it might be, it drives additional awareness and therefore engagement, with their technology people to see how can we use this?
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. I haven't heard this perspective of like, hey, AI has just sort of been around, right? So what happened? Something like some news story caught the right way, right, last year, and now
Yeah.
we're off to the races. And you come at it from a corporate perspective, but you also sort of alluded to the personal, right? Everyone has that compute in their pocket, right? And if you can just go on and twiddling your thumb, sitting around in the evening, you can start playing with pictures by describing it, right? I think that in mass starts to drive adoption as well. Okay, well, let's come to the power side, right? Because that's our audience. Give us some sense of maybe either using NVIDIA or some other sort of generalities. What is the step change in power usage?
Without getting too deep in the weeds here, we look at power in a couple of different ways as it gets used in data centers. And I guess the first thing I would say is that power is so important in data centers that that's how everything is discussed. When we talk about building a data center, we don't talk about the cost of constructing a data center like you would any other building. We talk about what's the cost per megawatt. And then when we talk about writing contracts for data center capacity, you don't bill your customers based on the amount of square feet you're consuming. You bill your customers based on the number of kilowatts they contract for. And so power is just, it's core to everything. And while we might touch on this a little bit later, one of the issues that we'll get to is power constrained markets that can't quite deliver enough power. And that becomes an interesting situation. And like I said, we'll get to that in a minute. But anyways, historically, let's say we use power per cabinet. So data centers use these cabinets or racks to put all the IT equipment in. And historically, the amount of power required per cabinet or rack is somewhere around 3 to 5 kilowatts. Now that's been growing over time, right? And so now the average is 7 to 8 kilowatts a cabinet. But that's the average across the industry when you include all the companies that they're not very good at managing their racks. But when you start looking at the biggest consumers of servers, for example, the servers are the core of any IT function. Everything else, storage, networking, and all the other devices falls in line after servers. But the biggest consumers of servers are what we refer to as the hyperscale cloud providers. And from our view, there's a lot of definitions for hyperscale cloud, but from our view, there's 4 in particular: Amazon, Google, Meta, and Microsoft. And if you look at the amount of money they spend on data centers and IT equipment, it far eclipses everybody else. But there's a lot of other big buyers of those servers. And because they're such huge consumers, they get to be a little bit more sophisticated. So we look at individual companies. We'll look at Amazon and Meta and Microsoft and Google, and we'll look at the evolution of the architecture of their servers over time. And as they evolve, they consume more and more power. So while the average might be, say, 8 kilowatts a cabinet across the broader industry, when you start looking at these, hyperscale companies in particular, and there's many others, but they are more in the 15 kilowatts a cabinet. So twice, if not 3 times the size. And some of them are running higher densities than that. Now, the contrast here, which is driving the conversation about where are we going to get our power, is that when you start looking at the AI hardware, that stuff can consume anywhere from 40, 50 kilowatts a cabinet on up to 100 kilowatts a cabinet. Huge implications there because A, it's a lot of power, but B, it's a whole different ballgame trying to keep that stuff cool so you're not melting down your $250,000 servers.
Crazy. Yeah, so there's actually more power needed. That undersells the power increase then.
Yeah.
Because it's just the compute power, not the cooling power.
Right.
Wow.
So yeah, it's big.
That's crazy. Okay, well, a perfect segue into power constraints.
Yeah, so power constraints aren't really new, but it's kind of like the AI thing. We've heard little tidbits here and there about power constrained markets like Singapore and Amsterdam. But when Northern Virginia, and just for the audience, Northern Virginia, essentially the epicenter of Northern Virginia is Ashburn, Virginia, is the biggest data center market in the world. It's just enormous. I forget how many data centers there are, but it's at least a couple of hundred, which is crazy a lot. So, the story was that as time went on, so many data centers are being built there that Dominion Power, who provides the power to that area of the state or the country, doesn't have the transmission capacity to be able to get power to a lot of those data centers. So some of those projects are being delayed. And so there's all kinds of little pockets here and there, right? And so when a data center company looks at a market, whether it's Chicago or Dallas or Phoenix or, Salt Lake, the first question is always, how much power can I get? Can I get the amount of power that I need, and how soon can I get it? And if that's the first and primary question, and if the answer to that question isn't, what you're hoping for, then no other questions get asked. And so, it's significant enough in certain areas that the power constraints are significant enough in certain areas that, yeah, that's the real driving force behind siting data centers is, what's my short and long-term power potential.
Yeah, and I think you sort of alluded to that getting to Virginia, right? There's always been places in the world that are power constrained, right? But if we're taking this enormous set of digital infrastructure and 5xing its power consumption, and then trying to 5x the underlying digital infrastructure, right? I mean, effectively, everyone becomes power constrained almost overnight.
Yeah. And, one of the interesting things, and just, going back here, I'm a data center guy. I'm not a nuclear engineer. I don't have an electrical engineering background and any of that kind of stuff. As we've looked at, some of the issues that are challenging the market with regard to delivering power, a lot of it is the transmission networks. There are various reports, where they illustrate that, the power generation capacity is great here. In fact, there's a lot of stranded power, but we can't share it with other grid sections of the country because there's no transmission capacity. And my understanding, we'll need a different expert to really dig into this, but is that building transmission infrastructure is very long term and a lot of regulatory issues to deal with. And so, yeah, that's kind of a messy, interesting part of the whole puzzle, is how transmission is a big roadblock.
Hmm. Do you see people citing their data centers where there's that excess power? Like, I mean, has it sort of flipped the paradigm a little bit? That instead of waiting for transmission, you just go where there's supply?
Well, it's not brand new, but I mean, that's a really good point you're making there. And so there's a combination of ways that data centers are built, right? And so some data centers have to be specifically in metro areas. I have to be in Dallas because I have a latency issue and I need to be within so many milliseconds of my customers. And so there's a lot of data centers that have to be built there. In the case of the big cloud providers, let's say they decide I'm going to have a region, just as an example, in Frankfurt. Well, you're going to have data centers in Frankfurt to deal, or close by, right? But the other phenomenon that's been going on for a long time, actually, is companies building data center campuses pretty much out in the middle of nowhere. So they're out in Nebraska and Iowa and Kansas and Ohio. And I'm not dissing those states as being in the middle of nowhere, but you got a lot of space. The power prices are reasonable. A lot of those states have tax incentives. And so companies, in fact, all of them, Amazon, Google, Meta, Microsoft, Apple, also pick these places to build these data center campuses because it's just more economical to do it there, right? And so they'll make a deal with a company or a municipality, for example, that says, I'm going to spend this many billions of dollars and I'm going to build 1.2, 1.5 million square feet of data centers on this parcel that I've bought. And it could take me 5 to 10 years. But they put together a package like that, and it's big. And so, when they go to some kind of local government, their eyes get big and they're like, ooh, geez, $2.5 billion in our community. And so that's where they strike up these deals. And so, again, the first question is always, what's our power profile look like? But you don't hear about where they're building these campuses having those issues. And there's a lot of them in all kinds of places. Reno, Nevada, or in Sparks, Nevada, for example, is pretty much out there, but it's attracted a number of large data center projects just because they have what everybody needs. And the other important part about that is that these companies that build these data centers out there, they're not shy about somehow being able to get their people to where those data centers are. There's local talent. Sometimes they might have to bring people in, but anyways, it doesn't scare them away to go out, out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, as a Nebraskan native, you've got the wrong guy, but no, I get it. And it certainly drives a lot of local labor, right? It is a really attractive thing for those states and those communities. But I do think, I don't know how long that runway really goes, right? Because if you go back on our per rack conversation, right, that 1.5 million square feet is going, it was consuming maybe hundreds, maybe, I don't know, I'm making up these numbers, 150 megawatts or whatever it is. I don't know what the actual ratio is, but if it's 5 times that, right, if you replace all that power with something that's using 5 times that amount, all of a sudden what was a couple 100 megawatt draw becomes a couple gigawatt draw, and that sops up extra generating capacity in these markets pretty darn quick, right? It starts to eclipse the city that they're next to.
Well, it's like any other infrastructure project, right? It just you have to weigh everything that's going on there. And so, what's not particularly common, I built a 150,000 square foot data center, and that 150,000 square foot data center will have 75,000 square feet of space to put computers and racks and stuff like that. That's just a rough ratio. You get about half your space to put the compute in. The rest of it's power distribution and cooling. And so if you were to go back, 5, 6, 7 years ago, you might be looking at, say, 8 megawatts for 75,000 square feet. I mean, it was, let's call it 10 years ago. And that's been growing, quite a bit. And so in today's world, we might be looking at, 30 megawatts, for 150,000 square foot data center, even up to, say, 80 megawatts, depending on the purpose of the data center. So an older data center, it can be a challenge to upgrade all that to do that. In fact, it's way easier to just build another new one.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And if you look at the rate of new data center construction announcements that come out from these companies, again, Amazon, Google, Meta, Microsoft, in particular, yeah, I mean, the newer data centers are planned for that kind of capacity. The cost of upgrading older data centers, not so much. And what's important is that there will always be what I would refer to as utility compute servers, right? They're just doing run-of-the-mill stuff. They're Google serving ad pages and web pages and doing web crawling and stuff like that. And, those aren't high-powered servers like the NVIDIA AI hardware. So there's still plenty of compute to be done that doesn't require that kind of density. And so newer data centers, yeah, very dense. Older ones, some will get upgraded, but generally speaking, that's a less palatable way to go.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. In my mind, it was a very fungible, right? The pizza box approach, and you just slide in a different pizza box. But that's interesting insight. What are you hearing or seeing in terms of people like bringing their own power, right? Self-generation or energy as a service solutions. What's the chatter on the data center side there?
Well, I mean, it's not unheard of, but it is not common. And, so there are some data centers where they're using some on-site generation in the form of like fuel cells or something like that. There's some data centers that have a little bit of solar, which is really a vanity project. You can't do much with 500 kilowatts of solar, on your rooftop or something like that. And so I don't see it yet as common. I don't work in that piece of the industry, so there could be things going on that I'm not aware of. But Equinix is the biggest data center company in the world from a revenue perspective. And I think it was Equinix, and they had a data center to be built in Ireland, and they wanted to put in their own power generation, natural gas, something or other. I don't remember what it was. And essentially the local government turned them down and said, no, you can't generate your own power. And so, I mean, that's a whole nother story about pushback for data centers, as you would find pushback for nuclear as well, from local communities. Anyways, I don't feel like I really answered that, but what I'm seeing is not an awful lot, and not I'm not seeing there's anything that's around the corner that's going to be a game changer.
And is that so you hit on a couple of reasons why that may be the case. You feel like it's just because of the lack of options? Like I don't think people appreciate it. I don't think people appreciate your point around rooftop solar. They see all these panels and they're like, oh, it's fantastic, right? But it like barely covers the electronic door locks. And then yeah, just pure availability, right? If you're trading being constrained by the grid to being constrained by the gas network, you may not be much better off, right? So do you think that's why it's like a lack of available resources to provide on-site power, or is it just as a stretch of people's business models? Is it too much development risk? Like what do you think are the key hurdles there?
Gosh, that silence means I don't know.
Yeah. That's an okay answer too, right?
Yeah, I was going to say,
if you knew, you'd probably be building a bunch of data centers, right?
Yeah, right. No, I think it's a combination of all those things, but I think also that whether we're talking about, hydrogen or natural gas or, geothermal or any of those things, they're evolving markets. And so, particularly those, solar and wind are a little bit more mature. They're certainly not without their issues. But obviously developing, multi-megawatt solar plant or wind plant is not part of the infrastructure budget, for a data center company. They don't really run on margins like the hyperscale cloud guys. It's a whole different game. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I just don't, it's not quite there yet. And so, we're going to see the same thing as nuclear continues to sort of develop in its journey. We're early innings. It's like AI. AI has been around for a long time. Nuclear has been around for a long time. Even small nuclear has been around for a long, long time. But now we're working into these um, different ways of trying to create this baseload generation in more localized areas to serve a very specific set of either communities or businesses or something like that. And that's where we're in the early evolution stage, I think. And so it's going to take a while for some of that stuff to mature. I think Bloom Energy came out with their Bloom boxes, fuel cells, a long time ago. I don't even want to say what I think it might have been because I'm sure I'll be way off. And while I think they do a fair business, it's again a technology that just didn't take the industry by storm. The economics aren't quite there yet.
Yeah, and I think they yeah, it's maybe a decade ago, right? I mean, it's been
Yeah,
some
that's something.
time, and yeah, it's hydrogen ready, right? But still a natural gas source, and your kind of retail natural gas rates, it gets a little bit tough.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, I think there's some unique aspects of the data center demand profile that make, nuclear, maybe geothermal, certainly some of the hydropower solutions, really the only suite of options, right? I'm very bearish on hydrogen personally, but I've, been proven wrong a number of times before. So what do I know? Um,
One of the really fascinating things, and by the way, I kind of tripped into this whole conversation about nuclear accidentally, a couple of years ago. But I kind of, blossomed. I find it really interesting. And so, but I was at a conference once where somebody was talking about the interesting thing about the evolution of nuclear and hydrogen is that with nuclear, we're taking what's this big and trying to make it this big, right? So we're not, you know, ignore for a moment submarines and aircraft carriers and those reactors. But if we look at traditional nuclear power plants, 3 reactors, a gigawatt each, what we're trying to do is smash that down into size. And that's been a real challenge. With hydrogen, it's the opposite. Hydrogen has always been kind of a small, in terms of the way it's implemented. And now in the hydrogen industry, we're trying to create a much bigger, expansive distribution of the fuel. Anyways, I just thought that was an interesting contrast between nuclear and hydrogen, how they're evolving.
yeah, that is interesting. I I've made the observation that for the data center and the nuclear space that we're sort of meeting in the middle, right? If nuclear is starting big and data center starting small, and they're going to kind of get to the right, the just right size in the middle. My thing with hydrogen is just the physics inefficiencies, right? It's not so much a technical challenge, but you're using energy, converting it into a carrier to convert it back into energy is um, you can't like Moore's law your way out of all of those losses. And so, um, whereas in the nuclear space, I think you actually said it, small nuclear has been around for 70 years, right? Like who started there, and not just military applications, right? Research reactors and medical isotope reactors and, hundreds of experiences with these smaller sizes at all kinds of levels, right? Small is relative to the space. And so, yeah, from what I observe, it's that sort of marrying the business models, because the other thing that you said, I'm just combining all of your bits of wisdom here, is yeah, data center developers don't want to develop power plants, right? They don't really want to do that work. They don't want to spend their capital on that. And so that's where I think Bloom energy, while it hasn't scaled given the unit economics, I feel like the business model is one that could be really captured by some of these more distributed nuclear solutions.
Again, it's a waiting game. It's waiting for things to, kind of mature. And I was talking to somebody, I don't know, about a week ago, and we were talking about, the price of, the price per kilowatt of wind and solar, over a 10-year period, going down. And as I was talking about this, I can't remember who I was talking to. They started pointing out flaws in the way that I was thinking about it. And the end result was, and I'm breaking this rule right here, was, yeah, I probably shouldn't talk about that. Don't use that as an example, because somebody that really understands the mechanics and the economics in those industries, yeah, don't talk about things you really don't know anything about.
Fair. It's a good rule of thumb. It's
I know,
probably
right?
one that as a society we need to practice more often.
Yeah.
No, fascinating. Okay, just to maybe put a bow on it, anything that we didn't talk about that we should have?
You mean in terms of just nuclear in general?
Nuclear data center development, that the floor is yours.
Oh,
We meandered on a lot of topics. You get the
yeah.
last word, though.
Yeah. No, so, it's, one of the things I think that there's a few subjects really. One is sustainability in general, right? The notion of making it to net zero and yet still poo-pooing nuclear is foolishness. It's not well advised. And so, if you look at what happened at COP28 this year, just with regard to all the discussion about, here's where we need to go. We have too many issues with, and I'm not poo-pooing renewables for a moment. We need to keep,
Yeah,
I
of
think,
course.
continue doing that. But there needs to be more to adopt technologies that are going to get us closer to net zero in a more reasonable amount of time, and nuclear is part of that. So the other thing I would say is that the conversation really just, I mean, the very first article I saw written about nuclear power and data centers, SMRs in particular, was in 2008 by a guy named Rich Miller, who founded a media outlet called Data Center Knowledge. Rich is still in the industry. He runs something now called Data Center Frontier. But then it was kind of crickets for a long, long time. That company that you wrote about in 2008 went out of business, and so if you start looking at what's been going on, in the development of SMRs and microreactors, it's not something they just started yesterday. This has been going on for a long time. But what has happened, the reason the conversation is heightened, is that all of a sudden there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. When we start looking at the schedules for test reactors and things like that, and there's some projects, commercial projects that, are on the drawing board. So there's light at the end of the tunnel. And so the convergence is the light at the end of the tunnel for the development of these nuclear technologies, and the power constrained markets, and the demand, the increased demand for power. All these things kind of came together. And so the conversation around nuclear and data centers has heightened quite dramatically over the last year and a half. And so of the big hyperscale companies I talk about, the ones that are building just an ungodly amount of capacity, Microsoft has been the most vocal. They put out a policy paper on nuclear power just 2 or 3 months ago, and they've hired 3 different people into roles for assessing nuclear power. Now, we know some of the other big companies like that they're not ignoring it, not at all. But what's happening is that they're just not vocal about it. You don't, when you're a big public company like that, you don't make big announcements without a lot of assessment of, where that might go. So data centers, it's a long-term infrastructure journey. Some company can build a data center in a year. A lot of caveats in that, and I won't go through that.
Of course.
The big hyperscale guys, they tend to be more in the 24 to 36 month time frame. But the long-term planning, I mean, the data centers that are being built right now, were essentially first planned probably roughly about 5 years ago. So the time to start talking about how might this evolve? Should we be educating ourselves now? Should we be involved with the nuclear community is now. And I think the other thing that's happened is that the nuclear community has realized we're getting close enough. We can see that light at the end of the tunnel. We need to be engaging our primary customer profiles. So, data centers is one of them. The thing that I think caught the market off guard is all of a sudden the demand forecasting for power based on what's going on, and things lit up. I was having a conversation with somebody at Idaho National Labs one day, and I was telling him that, look, here in the United States, and don't quote me on this number, I'd have to look it up to be sure, but, we're looking at about 20 gigawatts of, power capacity. We have to be careful not to get power consumption and power capacity mixed up, but, and that's, that's crazy. That's a number of nuclear power plants just right there. Around the world, we're looking at, well, this is a long-term forecast, but, going out quite a few years, we can see where we might get to 200 gigawatts of capacity just for data centers.
Yeah.
And so I think right now I think in 2023, gosh, where were we? About 60 gigawatts, something like that. Anyways,
wow.
I guess the other parting shot I would have is that, we could have another 30-minute conversation about microreactors as opposed to SMRs and where those fit in terms of the data center industry. But just for, those that care, one of the things that's kind of come to light is that, if you want to start conversing with the industry, the people to start with is Idaho National Labs. And if for some reason it comes up, there's a perfect contact there where if I was a big data center company, that's who I would call. And that's the person that can navigate you through how the research labs work with people, the voucher programs they have. I mean, they are working hard to, include the industry. And I think you know this already, but in about 2.5, 3 weeks, we're running a morning workshop for about 3 hours at Data Center World in Washington, D.C. I hope to see you there, Michael.
I will be there. Yeah. And our listeners hopefully will show up as well.
Awesome. I can't wait to shake your hand.
But yeah, it'd be great.
We're so excited to have representatives from Idaho National Labs. Christine King and Shannon Bragg Sitton are going to be there. And then Katie Huff is doing a different presentation on a different day from Department of Energy. So we're real excited for that to come together. And last year we had some sessions on nuclear and they were very well attended. People are curious. They're curious. And the good news, again, another 30-minute call on public perception and how that differs between public perception and the data center industry. Data center industry is much more open, about nuclear power. And we've seen that numerous times in the different events that we've held and things like that. So it's an exciting time. And most people look at it and say, the timeline, it looks like it's a long, far way away. Well, I mean, in 10 years, I'm going to be 10 years older. That's not something I'm looking forward to. But at the same time, this is the time for the conversations to get going.
Yeah, we have to start getting real about it now so that we can deliver.
Exactly.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah, what a way to button up our at least initial conversation. Looking forward to discussing more in person in a few weeks.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
It's great fun. My pleasure. Thanks, Michael.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.